Hi. I got a little nervous about this whole making it up in the moment thing. And so I called a friend whose job is to coach TED speakers. And I said, can you give me the short course? And he said, oh, yeah. You only need to know 2 things. I was like, oh, great, I can do that. He said, the first thing is you need to avoid CHS, and then you need to learn to avoid OPS, and you'll be fine. I was like, okay, what's CHS? And he said, clicker hand syndrome. He said a lot of people, they get a clicker in their hand and they forget that part of their body moves independently, and so they start gesticulating and the clicker just stays there. I thought, well, I can do that. I can work without CHS. And then I said, so what's OPS? And he said, overly profound syndrome. He said a lot of people find out that they're giving a TED talk and they think they need to use it to change the world. What's your talk about? So I hung up, and here I am. But where this talk was actually born was in a conversation I had about 5 years ago with my wife and my son, who at that point was finishing university. He'd just been traveling in Senegal. And the question that we were asking ourselves over a cup of tea was, if it was your job to change the world, how would you do it? And that's what I'm going to invite you to explore with me over this bit of time we have together. If it was your job to change the world, your job, like someone hired you and said, right, here you go, we got a great salary for you, all you got to do is change the world. How would you do it? And when we were exploring that with each other, my son went first, and he said, well, education. I'd institute mandated universal education. Because when people see that there's a world beyond their world, that there are countries beyond their country, there's thinking beyond their thoughts, it does something for them. It opens them up. It makes them more human, and in becoming more human, more humane. We thought that was a pretty good answer. And my wife, Nina, she said, well, I think if we all just loved each other a bit more, that would do it. And Oliver and I, being men of the world, rolled our eyes, and Disney princess. But she had a point. If we all did just love each other a little bit more, it probably would change the world for the better. And then it was my turn, and I realized that we'd kind of asked the question, and I hadn't thought about the answer. I was like, oh no, I'm supposed to come up with a profound answer. This is what I do. And so rather than share my answer, what I wanted to kind of share with you is a few of the kind of notes to myself that have helped me over the last 5 years kind of find my answer and might be useful to you in finding yours. And the first one is a quote by Albert Einstein. Now, there's a lot of versions of this quote floating around the internet. This is the most accurately sourced one I could find. And he said, no problem can be solved by the same kind of thinking that created it. Now, what that means is, the one place we know the answer to how can I change the world won't be found is in what you already think, in what you already think you know. Because the world as it is the fruit of our thinking as it is. Now, that doesn't tell us what to think, but it gives us a really good idea of what's not worth continuing to think about. And as I was exploring that, and I began to kind of sit and look, well, gee, if this really was my job, I don't think I'd take it, right? I think I'd go no, because who? It sounds like you got to be like really worthy to change the world. Right? Like you've got to be really amazing to change the world. You've got to be willing to row the Atlantic and write your own cookbook and play music and do all this other stuff if you're going to change the world. And that's how it looks to us. It looks like changing the world is something for special people, right? It's not something ordinary. It's not something you or I could do. It's for those people. And that sort of fear of not being worthy really came to a head for me at one point when I was offered 2 jobs in the same week. Now, one of the jobs, I used to do cartoon voiceovers. And so one of the jobs was to play a mouse in Clifford the Big Red Dog. I was very excited about that, right? And then one of my clients called and he said, look, we'd like to fly you to the Middle East, sneak you into Palestine, and have you help mediate some peace talks. I'm like, oh, no. Because I kind of knew that's the one I should want to do. But I really wanted to do the mouse in Clifford the Big Red Dog, and it was a very stressful week. Now, as it happened, both jobs fell through, so I never had to make the decision. But I felt, and I don't usually compare myself to a saint, but I felt a bit like St. Augustine when he said, Lord, please make me pure and chaste, but not today, right? And that carried on that sort of push-pull of worthiness until I heard a quote from an enlightened Scottish welder named Sid Banks. And he said, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. That did a world of good for me. Because I realized it wasn't about telling a better story. It wasn't about building up my self-worth. It wasn't about convincing myself that I could. It wasn't even about disciplining my mind. It was about recognizing that we don't need to be the hero of our own story. We don't even need a story. Life goes on through us anyways, no matter what we think. And the less we try and shape life to the story we've made up about ourselves, the more alive we are. The more life flows through us. And that aliveness begins to enliven the people around us. I had lunch with a Zen master once. And I always thought it was a very expensive lunch for a Zen master, but we had lunch. And one of the things I was really curious to ask him, because this is somebody who has taken on in his own way the job of changing the world. And there's a concept in Zen called transmission. And the idea behind transmission is that the master transmits the Dharma to the students, and the students become enlightened. And I thought, well, that would be good. So I asked him over lunch, I said, how do you do that transmission thing? And I've got my mental notebook out. And I've always remembered his answer because it wasn't what I expected. He said, there is something awake in me that is asleep in most people. And when they spend time with me, it wakes up in them. And the more time they spend, and through the various practices in his tradition, the more awake that is. And sometimes, through grace, not will, what is fully awake in me awakens fully in them. And at that moment, transmission is said to have taken place, although at no point did anything pass from teacher to student. When you stop thinking about yourself, all that's left is all there is. And that aliveness bubbles up through your pores. It bubbles up through your eyeballs. It bubbles out into the world because it awakens the aliveness in the people that you are with, and they begin to change. They begin to see differently. They begin to see through their own story, to see beyond the limits they've made up about themselves, no matter how cool those limits are. The best version of you can make up in your head is not a patch on the infinite potential of life. And so that led me to a kind of a third note to myself from George Bernard Shaw. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. See, we think changing the world is going to be about sacrifice. We think changing the world is about giving up our passion for the right thing, the good thing, the noble thing. But the true joy in life comes when we stop trying to be in charge of something we were never in charge of and let life live us. Let ourselves come alive. The Reverend Howard Thurman was an interesting link point between Gandhi and Martin Luther King. He was a student of Gandhi's and a teacher of Martin Luther King. And he said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. And we come alive when we throw ourselves into anything that we do as if our life depended on it, knowing full well that it doesn't. To throw ourselves into whatever we do as if the fate of the world depended on it, knowing full well that 99.9% of the time, it really doesn't. And what begins to happen as we throw ourselves in day after day, as we allow ourselves to be a vehicle for life? I had a student on one of my programs who was in the military. He was a pilot. And he struggled with this idea that he didn't need to work on himself, that he didn't need to have a better opinion of himself, that he didn't need to continually train his own mind, that he could actually trust life. And a metaphor came to me. And I said, here's the thing. You're not the pilot on this mission. You're the plane. We are the vehicle through which life changes. And if we allow ourselves to be used, you can't even imagine where that can take you. So I want to ask you to do a little thought experiment. And I'm going to suggest you close your eyes. And with your eyes closed, I want you to see, who are you without a story? Who are you without all your thinking about who you are? Without thought, can you feel your skin color? Without thought, can you feel your religion? Without thought, can you feel your nationality? Who are you before thought? Now, my first note to myself from Albert Einstein: a problem cannot be solved with the same kind of thinking that created it. In my life, in my work, I have seen two primary kinds of thinking that create the problems in the world. And the first, I've devoted my life to teaching about. And it's the difference between outside in and inside out. And if you're interested in that, there's a TED Talk called Why Aren't We Awesomer, where I go into it in a lot more depth. But in short, it's the difference between the idea that my pain and suffering can be caused by the world. If I think that which is outside me can create my experience on the inside, then I have no choice but to defend or attack or try and mold the world to change the way I feel. But the world of experience only works in one direction. Our experience of life is always created from in to out. What we are experiencing on the inside gets projected out onto the world, and we experience things as scary or wonderful or horrifying or beautiful. But the other kind of thinking, the other kind of almost universal thought that leads to most of the problems in the world, as best I can see, is that there's a difference between us and them. And you can define us and them any way you want. But as long as there is an us that is different to them, whether that us is better than them, worse than them, smarter than them, not as smart as them, we have the basis for conflict. We have the basis for struggle. We have the basis for protectionism. We have the basis for greed. Now, I was thinking about how to express that. And I remembered something my wife wrote a couple of years after that original conversation. And I want to finish by sharing it with you. Travel broadens the mind, they say. I like to think that's true. I've traveled a good portion of the world thus far, and the thought which frequently strikes me is the knowledge that throughout the world, we are all the same. All the same. Now, I know full well that statement will get some criticism in this current climate, and by the way, this current climate would be current no matter when I was reading this aloud. Thoughts of ISIL and Israel and a whole host of global injustices come screaming forth. I get it. I've been spending a good amount of time lately having those thoughts too. Thoughts that fill me with horror and fear and repulsion. They rile me up to the extent that I feel the stress physically. Anybody know that feeling? I won't let myself feel hatred. Hating another person is tantamount to hating oneself. Why? Because we are all the same. To me, that means we all want to live and learn and grow and love. Some of us want to serve. Some of us want to inspire change. Some of us just want to be where we are in any given moment. Many of us are damaged, some more than others. A bunch of us think it's just fine to justify our damage by inflicting harm on others. Many of us react. We react to that by sequestering ourselves into our little corner of the world, surrounding ourselves with like-minded people, protecting ourselves with the necessary accoutrements, getting riled up over and over and over again. And then there are a bunch of people, and I have had the wonderful pleasure of knowing some, who acknowledge the damage in people, open their doors to them, truly love them, hope for the best for them and the rest of humanity. Gosh, I wish I could be like that. My greatest hope is that my children expansively open up their hearts to the plight of others in the world and do their best to know that we are, sing it with me now, all the same.